Francisco, you can make a start.
We can't? Do we have... Oh, sorry, it was... Okay. Strange, I just see ourselves here at the invite. Well,
No, you can make a start. We got already attendees, actually.
Okay, great. Well, in that case, let's get cracking. And first of all, thank you very much to everyone attending our webinar. So, and if you can see my screen, yeah, I think you do. Quick introduction to why we're here. So right now, 8 of the world's top 20 pharmaceutical companies already trust Immuta to unlock the power of their data. Even so, most organizations are still trying to scale AI on top of access models that are built for tickets, approvals, manual workflows, and that simply doesn't hold up. We have Immuta as the engine, BI4ALL getting you behind the wheel and driving it safely and at speed in a regulated environment. What we have here today is the two sides for this big picture. We have the platform, only half of the story, the other half being the governance, design, maturity, and the change, and that's the half where pharma stalls right now. So that's us together. Starting here with a quick introduction. Myself, I'm Francisco. I'm the Senior Account Executive and Lead for Life Sciences at BI4ALL, and I would hand over to Sandro for introductions.
Hello, everyone. Indeed, my name is Sandro, and I'm the Head of Data Strategy and Governance Center of Excellence at BI4ALL. Bart?
Yeah, thanks for joining. My name is Bart, Field CTO at Immuta. And I'll kick off the presentation by introducing Immuta. Might not be a name that you've heard of. So what we do is we make sure that the right people have access to the right data. It's about, do you have access to a certain table? Do you have access to a certain database, catalog, you name it? But then it's also more fine-grained than that. Can you see all the columns? Can you see all the rows? Is certain data redacted, masked, or can you see all of it? So we provision the access. And traditionally, that could be done based on groups and the people that use the data. But in today's world, with especially with AI, everyone wants to consume data. Everybody can go to the data. It's no longer just the researchers that need access to clinical trial data, and the people in the supply chain that need access to supply chain data, but the whole organization wants to get access to data, and it needs to be governed. If you go to the next slide, Francesco, what you'll see is that if you do that with the traditional systems, it's typically done based on tickets. People can go to a central platform, they find a certain table or a certain schema they want to have access to. They request access, and that access goes through approval chain, where then first the manager needs to approve it, then maybe somebody in the business needs to approve it, and then it goes to IT to actually implement that. And that kind of worked, where you had the era where people have individual apps and people had their own databases. When you moved to the cloud and people started to use the cloud more, that's already a lot of tickets, and people started to feel the burden of it. But now with AI pilots and AI at scale, the number of tickets is just exploding. It's no longer just the supply chain people that need access to supply chain data, but it's now that whole organization that's going to request access to those different data sets. So in order to solve that problem, there's two ways to manage those entitlements. And that's what I'll show in the next slide, Francesco. So if you talk about the entitlement problem, we believe that there's two ways to provision the access. It's the provision by policy. If you know that you're in a certain department, you should have access to certain data. If you require certain trainings to be done to see certain assets, that's all in the policy, that's all in the rule. But then there's always exceptions. There's people that want to have additional access that cannot be automated. And that's the provision by request. People can request access and get their access. And those two are very aligned. Maybe people will request access, but in order to comply with GxP, for example, you need certain trainings. data is based in the US, like only people in the US can have it. So that's where you get an overlap by the request and the policy. So what I will do later in this webinar is give a quick presentation of like how those like policies can work with those request flows. But that's all very technical. It's all about like the rules. It's about like, okay, if something is labeled X, then we need to do Y. But you still need those rules. You need to define those policies. You need to define those rules, and you need to set up that framework. And that's why I'm very happy to have our partners here, BI4ALL, have experience in its field and can help you go through this transition. So can I give the word to you, Francisco?
Thank you, Bart, and thank you very much for that segue. And for those of you that don't know us, BI4ALL by Plexistep is a Portuguese company, currently now globalized already in terms of footprint. We have multiple sectors that we work with, but and I am very much partial to this, especially in pharma. We work with many global customers. In fact, between BI4ALL and Immuta, we have a great many deal of relevant customers. Those 8 that currently already use Immuta are part of this list here. There are many others that we BI4ALL work with as well. And what exactly do we do? So we work with pharmaceutical companies across the value chain. So from research and development, all the way through pharmacovigilance after market launch, working through manufacturing, supply chain, commercial and marketing, also medical affairs, and covering all of these functions. What we bring, the value that we add to our customers is indeed on making sure that their data really adds value to their company, that they get to gather insight from internal and external data. So on top of being a technological partner to our customers, we also support them in a number of disciplines where, in fact, data strategy is one of the most relevant. It's probably the fundamental pillar that really drives data execution moving forward. And in a few moments, Sandra will talk to us a bit more about that. So why are we here? The fact is that currently pharmaceutical companies are exploring very, very much into AI insights, how AI can optimize, can support and accelerate their processes. This is happening much more than it was maybe a couple of years ago around the R&D, around clinical trials, as well as manufacturing and commercial. What we have is a lot of focus on AI, but we need also to understand that this is one of the most regulated industries and working with the most sensitive of data, patient data that we have on personal information, we have omics, we have pharmacovigilance data, and all of this together currently is blocking the scale of these AI-enabled engagements. The fact is that we currently still have a lot of manual approvals. This is something that impacts not only the approval, but also the revoking of that approval. So right now, people will have delayed access and potentially have access to sensitive information for longer than they should. And of course, there's lack of consistent access governance across domains. Through all of this, one thing is key: auditability is definitely demanded by compliance. So today, what we will be looking at is first a demo from Immuta that Bart will deliver to us. Then we'll talk about how do we bring all of this to life and some of our relevant use cases together. And then we'll have some room for Q&A at the end. With this, Bart, I would hand over back to you for a quick demo on Immuta. Can you share your screen?
Yes, I'll take over the screen share. If you can stop sharing. There you go.
All done.
So I should be able to see my Snowflake screen. And I'm using Snowflake for today's demo as like one of the many platforms that you can use to utilize the data. So whether you're using, like in this case, Snowflake, or you're using Databricks, whether you're in the AWS ecosystem with, like, for example, like Lake Formation or Redshift, and Google with BigQuery, like there's the many different data platforms out there. And I'm using Snowflake directly today. But of course, like you could also be using like any of the BI tools on top of that, or maybe of the data science platforms, maybe your terminal, or even agents. Like maybe you're leveraging like Claude to interrogate the data that's within Snowflake. That all shouldn't matter. As what matters is that like people in your organization want access to data and they want that access quickly. So what I'll be showing over the next like 5 to 10 minutes is a quick overview of like, okay, how can you define rules? What are rules? Like what like is part of those rules in order to get that access done for all those people, both in that like automated way, that like provisioned by policy that I talked about, but then also, okay, I don't have access to certain data. How can I request it? Like I need more. And like have the like time bound but fully governed access. And then once that's done, I'll also show, okay, but like how can you use all this information to prove that only the right people will have access to the right data? And there's many regulations already today, but like more coming soon, where like that's critical. Like it's not just about like making sure that like people have access to the right data, but it's also being able to prove that only the right people have access to the right data. And managing access shouldn't be something that you spend all time on. Like managing access to data is something that should be standardized. Like you have rules, regulations, like there's law that put on paper that, for example, personal data or patient's information need to be redacted, unless you have a certain use case for it, the right approvals, the right consent, etc. And instead of like asking engineers to implement that rule every single object over and over again, it would be great as if you, as an organization, you can define those rules more globally. Rules that can like be reused, and that like you don't have to change like for every single object, but you can say like, no, as an organization, this is my standard, and this is an exception to that standard. So think about, okay, as a standard, if somebody has access to a certain clinical trial in our clinical trial management system, people should automatically have access to those clinical trials. If you're in supply chain, you're automatically getting access to supply chain data. But if one of the columns contain like patient information in that kind of data, it needs to be redacted and people need to do their training first. It's those rules and policies that should drive that access. And for today's demo, I will use this like patient's demographics table. So what I can do is I can run a query against this table and it will give me that data. Immuta has already given me this data. So maybe I'm in the right team, completed the right training. Maybe I requested access and was approved. Like there's different ways to get that data, but this is how I got it. I didn't want to go into too much detail like how that's been done. If you want to go into more details, we're more than happy to schedule like a wider demo that can go into more depth to talk about the different policies that we have. But I wanted to focus on this example first, where you'll see that I have access to like a patient's ID. You can see that like people have like a medical history, etc. But then information like their names, their date of birth, their gender, their ethnicity, that's all being redacted. And of course, it's being redacted. It's highly sensitive data that you don't want to give to everyone. And this is not something that's done on this table. No, you need to make sure that like all PII data got masked. And that's what we do in the policies, and that's what we define in the rules. So let me switch to Immuta. This is what like our platform looks like. And in there you have policies, there's the rules. So in Immuta, you could define subscription policies, which means do you have access to the object? Can you see this like clinical trial data, or can you see the supply chain data? Can you see the HR object if it's not sensitive? It's like yes, no. I said I'm not going into too much detail on that today, but what I wanted to do is like go into that data policy. It's about like masking the data. So instead of like having to go to every single column, in Immuta, I only have this like one rule. I want to mask all the columns that are tagged as like PII using a redacted by Immuta constant. So what Immuta has done is like we found every single PII column and made sure that was replaced by redacted by Immuta. There's different ways to understand like what's PII. So like Immuta has integrations to the different data catalogs out there. So maybe you tag it in your data catalog. Maybe you tag it in your data platform, like maybe you're using a Snowflake tag, or maybe you're using Immuta for that. So also in Immuta, there's the capabilities to scan the data and better understand like what kind of data you have and find that PII data in there. But that's all it needs. Like you define a rule, mask all the columns, tag PII, make it a constant, and then Immuta go to your like 10, 100,000, like 10,000 objects and make sure that all those columns are getting masked. But then how do you handle exceptions? Because like maybe that data shouldn't be masked for everyone, but it should be masked by everyone except the people that, for example, are assigned to that specific study, for example, or that have a certain job type. That's something that you can put in a policy, and that's those like entitlement by policy. But then there's also the exceptions that you might want to handle. Like somebody should be able to request that access and go to that form. Now, what traditionally would happen is that you would create like security group or Active Directory groups, one with and one without the PII. But that should give you access to all PII. So then you're over provisioning, you're giving too much access. And you're not creating like a security group per column. So you like companies had to find a balance between, okay, I want to have a system that's manageable, that's not having too many security groups, too many approvals. But on the other hand, like there was also a level of fine grainness that they had to bring in order to comply with the rules and regulations. Now with Immuta, that's no longer necessary. Like you can actually go super fine grained while still having that control. So in order to raise an exception, what I can do as a consumer, as a user, I can go to my data catalog and find my object and raise an exception request from there. Or I could go to Immuta, where I can find the different assets or data products. And I was talking about like patient records. So I can go there and like see like that individual like patient record, like data product. And this is actually the object that I'm looking at. And instead of having to request access to the whole object or the whole table, what I'll do is I go to columns. And this gives me the overview of like all the columns that this specific object has. So you see that like I have all those columns, but then the name, last name, date of birth, gender, and ethnicity were all being redacted. And what I can do is I can raise a masking exception. I click on this button and say, okay, well, for my specific study, my specific project, my research, I need only this like gender and this ethnicity column. I don't need the date of birth or the names, like that's not relevant for my study. So I'm not requesting those, but it's those two columns that are relevant for me that I would like to have. And then Immuta will present you with the form. I can request access for myself or maybe request access on behalf of like an agent or a service principal. Then you need to define your use case. So for my, it's like just analytics. In your case, it will be way more specific, like use cases that have been approved by your organization and are tailored to your needs. And then you can define like how long you need it for. Like maybe a month, maybe 3 months. Well, this is so sensitive. I don't want to request it for a full month. Maybe I only want to request it for, let's say, 5 hours or 5 days, for example. Like that's all I need it for. So I can have a very tailored, very specific access request to columns. Like we're not asking like to a whole schema or to all PI. No, I'm only asking access to those 2 columns. And I can submit that access request. Now, what will happen is that Immuta understand, okay, like this is patient's information. That's part of the like the development domain. And I know who the approvers are for it. So Immuta will send like a Teams notification or Slack or an email to those different like owners, those stewards. And that's like where they'll get this like exception request. Bart requests an exception for 2 columns for the next 5 days. These are like the questions that he answered. And here are the 2 columns that like he requested access to, and this is how those columns are labeled. So from the approver, you're not getting a request from somebody that you don't know to have access to a group that you probably don't understand because of like naming conventions, but you really see like who requested this, what did they request, why, how was it labeled, etc. And then I can continue with determination, say, okay, well, 5 days, well, maybe I would like to do 3 days. And you say, good luck with your research project. You can define, okay, like why you're approving it. And that's all I need to do. So as a governor, as a steward, as a data owner, I can approve the request, click on it, that's fine. Now the consumer receives an email, and that's all they need to do. What the Immuta is doing on the background is calculating, okay, like what does that mean? Like what was the columns that were approved? Where should we apply that exception? And we actually go to those individual objects that are requested access to and make sure that like we unmask that. Now, if we use the same object with like 20 people, then we're not like lifting that exception or we're not removing that mask for everyone, but we're just doing that for like the one person that made this access request. And we actually do that in the data platform. So if I go back to Snowflake, what Immuta has done is like we place the policy there. And that's why I said in the beginning, it's not dependent on like how people consume the data, like whether they're using this interface, their BI tool, etc. on top. Like Immuta made sure that the rule is applied in Snowflake, or that we apply it in Databricks or in Redshift, etc. And it's that one policy that can span those multiple platforms. And then like once Immuta has processed all of it, I can go back to the same table, that same object, and rerun that same query. And now you'll see that those like gender columns and ethnicity columns are actually being in the clear. Like the exception applies to me, I can see it. And like after 3 days, once my request has been expired, that data will be redacted again. And by doing so, by leveraging those like policies and those exceptions, you can guarantee that you apply or that you comply with all the rules and regulations. Like you can have a rule in Immuta that says, okay, if you want to get access to patient data and there's like US patients in there, I want to automatically block all the requests from people that are not in the US, for example, if that's like part of the regulation. Or you can filter it a certain way that like the people get the right data. And all of this is being audited and traced. So you don't have to go through like SQL definitions or like configuration files where like all those individual masking policies are defined. But regulators or auditors, they can actually go to Immuta and they can get a list of all the access requests and there's exceptions and like understand, okay, who has access to what and when. And we even have a chat interface on top of that. So what people can do is they can go to this like comply app and understand like, okay, how do they comply? And they can ask questions to their data. So you can, for example, ask like, who have access to PII data in my org? And what the Immuta will do is it will like scan all the data sources, like, because we have information from your Snowflake, Databricks, like Redshift tables, etc. It will understand like the users, their trainings, etc. And based on that, like apparently there's 10 users who have access to PII data in the organization. It's a demo tenant, it's not that many, but you can imagine that if you have like many data sources with many policies, like this is a nice way to understand, okay, like who have this? But then you can ask follow-up questions. Okay, can you explain why they have access? So maybe like, is there an exception policy? Is there a rule? Is there something that they've requested it? And since Immuta has all that context, we can actually explain why they do have that access. So once Immuta is done thinking, it will probably say something like, hey, they've requested access in that marketplace, like I just did in the demo. And that's why they get this access. Like that's where you can see it. Like they're strictly granted access to this data because of the marketplace, that access request. And actually, there's also like a user, Marius, that got access because like he is a data owner. So in essence, what's important to understand is like Immuta is not just about like who has access to what data and making sure that it works, but also that you have the trust and the belief that you can actually prove that that's the right case. And by doing so, you can actually like also leverage like the latest AI techniques. Like you can trust agents because like agent only has the access that you set up. It's no longer a way to bypass the data, and the whole organization can see that. But again, it's important to set the right rules, to think about the framework, and that's where our partner BI4ALL comes in. So can I give back the screen sharing to you guys?
Right, thank you, Bart. Okay, can you hear me? Yep, just
loud and clear,
okay.
Sandro.
Great, lovely. Okay, right. let's move on. Okay, so what you've been seeing right now is basically Immuta in action. So what's Immuta? Immuta is the engine, an essential tool to be GxP compliant. And but let's say that what you saw is the end of the story. The truth is, if you like to bring it to life, there is a lot of pre-work that needs to be done, and this is actually when what actually triggered our partnership, our collaboration with Immuta. So, and now I would like to speak to you about how we can put all the pieces together and bring to life the Immuta platform when it comes to data products specifically. Okay, so to address data products in a regulated pharma environment, we normally leverage this blueprint, this data and AI product blueprint. What you see here is part of our reference materials, basically designed to give our consultants a clear, repeatable approach to build data products, data and AI products leveraging also Immuta. This blueprint reflects our hands-on experience in the sector and is focused on delivering scalable, compliant, and business-driven outcomes. It outlines the full end-to-end life cycle of a data product, from the initial idea through the production and value realization. Okay, to make it easier to follow, let's break it down step by step together. Okay, every data and AI product starts with a pre-initiation phase. Before build anything, we need to take some time to understand the landscape. We begin by mapping out the data domain, so we know which business area the product serves and which rules need to apply. Then we look at GxP and compliant. This is where we set the validation approach. The key thing is to understand once you automate the access control, that control itself becomes part of the validated system. So we treat it like like any other regulated component. We document it, we version control it, and we do it with quality assurance in line with the FDA and EU regulation for electronic records. From there, we assess data and AI best practices of the organization we are working with, and how well data is managed today. Then we check against a FAIR principle, and we see how ready is the organization for analytics and AI. Finally, we look at data sharing limitation. So we know where data can go across countries and the legal entities. In a nutshell, here is about building compliance from day one and by design. Once we pass this pre-initiation gate, we move to design. And we start by defining the business problem, the expected outcomes, and the success criteria together with the designated data product owner. At this stage, we support the product owner in shaping the product vision, the roadmap, the budget needed, and at the same time, we clarify what the enterprise governance requirements and how they will influence the Immuta configuration. We then gather more detailed requirements by leveraging business analysts, data governance, data and AI governance specialists, and of course, the various stakeholders. And we consolidate everything into user stories. This, of course, includes data contracts, so between producers and consumers. And also we align with consumption patterns, semantic models, ontologies, and domain interoperability. At the end of this phase, we will have a clear plan, including dependencies, stakeholder involved, and all the validation needed, necessary to move to the next phase with confidence. Once we pass also this other gate, we can move into build. This stage focuses first on data quality and metadata, which includes profiling the data, applying quality rules, cataloging the data, validating vocabulary, and enabling lineage and auditability. Then we move into data modeling, creating scalable consumption layers, integrating with the reference or reference data management systems if it's needed, wherever it's needed, depending on the use case. By the end of this stage, the product is not only built, but traceable, governed, and ready for controlled consumption. Next gate is the UAT, where we validate that the product is ready for business use. This includes confirming business acceptance, data quality, policy enforcement, auditability, and compliance evidence before moving to production. This is the moment where we know that our customer get excited about Immuta because they start seeing this in practice, how much time it has been saving, how easy. It's basically a response to previous frustrations. Once the product, the data and AI product goes live, the focus shifts to life cycle management, so monitoring, access reviews, policy updates, data quality checks, lineage, auditability, continuous adaptation to new business or regulatory needs, like Barta just mentioned. Regulatory needs keep changing. Think about the AI Act, for example. This is the foundation for governed data products in a regulated pharma environment. But the key question here is how do we make this governance operational, scalable, and enforceable in a day-to-day data access? This is basically where when BI4ALL and Immuta come together. And I built this slide to make concrete the split between what Immuta enforce and what BI4ALL enables. So if you look on the left-hand side, you can see what are the governance and capabilities that pharma organization need for AI. In the middle, you got what Immuta enforces, and on the right-hand side is what BI4ALL enables. So in a nutshell here, Immuta makes governance enforceable, and the BI4ALL makes it operational, adopted, and aligned to the business. We are not able to envisage a scenario where these two things cannot, I mean, if you would like to run a successful project, a successful adoption, where the two things live on their own. So this that's why our collaboration, and that's why today we are presenting to you. And because we know that every organization is a different point in their data journey, in their data and AI maturity journey. Together, BI4ALL and Immuta developed this framework to help companies adopt Immuta progressively. Okay. The idea is not to assume that everyone starts with the same level of maturity. Of course, some organizations are still discovering where sensitive data lives. Other instead have governance process, but need faster approvals, better automation, or stronger AI-ready access control. This framework helps structuring the journey. First, understanding the current landscape and risks. Then defining the right governance and access model, and ultimately implementing Immuta in a practical way, and at the very end, scaling adoption across more data, more user, and more use cases. So instead of treating Immuta as just only a platform, here we approach from the maturity perspective, and here is where we combine BI4ALL governance, operating model, and implementation expertise with immutability to enforce policies consistently and at scale. Now we would like to bring to you also some use cases, and Barta, this one is for you.
Yes, so we prepared 3 use cases where we would like to explain like where this is being used, how this could be used to like start to think about like, okay, where can we apply this? Like maybe where do we start and like where can we grow? And I will keep those like first two fairly high level and then give it back to Sandro to go into more detail about like the serve. So the first example, and they're both actual like customer examples, like real life, it's been implemented, is where like Immuta and the framework and like the policies like proactively give researchers access to data based on trial association. So when a researcher joins like the organization, there's typically like a clinical trial management system in place where individual researchers are assigned to individual studies or individual trials. But that's typically managed in that like trial management system. But that same information is not being reused to give access to like the raw data in the different data platforms, even though they want to do their statistical analytics on like the data platforms and the data that's actually being stored in those systems. So what this organization used to do before is they would manage security groups to give people access to the right data. But that means that for every single study, trial, system, country, like every like split of access, like every permutation of access, they had to create and maintain a security group in their Active Directory system. And that was about like 100,000 plus groups that had to be created, of which like, of course, a lot can be automated and set up, but then also maintained. And that was the tricky problem. If somebody was assigned to a new study, they were added to that group. But then like once the study was over or they moved to a new study, like nobody removed them from that group. They were just like requesting a new group and were added to that. So that gave like a real like GxP compliance issue because they had to prove that only the right researchers had access to the right studies. So when they used Immuta, they only had 5 Immuta policies in place. There's one policy that we're checking if they're actually like assigned to the right clinical trial system, like that study association. The other policy, we're checking if they're assigned to the right systems, like if they were allowed to see the data or not at all. There was one policy that would check like, okay, are you in the right country? Like some countries have specific filters to it. And there was a policy that were checked, and that's actually multiple policies that checked if you have done the right training. So in order to see patients' information, they had to do a patient's information training in their e-learning system. And it's those 5 policies that were driving access to many, many, many different objects. And if they had to prove that only the right people have access, instead of getting an Excel sheet export with a list of all the people that have access and like all those people needed to be checked manually, they could actually say like, here we have those 5 policies and we have proof that all those people are assigned to the right trial because that's in a trial system. We can prove that they have done the right training because that's coming from their e-learning system. And we have proof that they're in the right country because that's coming from the HR systems. And if people would move around, assigned to new studies, or maybe training is expiring or they do new training, Immuta automatically orchestrated that automated access for those clinical trials. And that not only allowed them to see the data or not, but it could also apply blinding rules based on classification. So if you're assigned to the right study and you have the right type of researcher, then maybe some of the blinding rules were exempt from you. So that's the first example I wanted to give. The other example is about like cross-border access. So global organizations, they don't just think about, okay, I need to make sure that my data in Switzerland is all right, or in Belgium or the Netherlands, but they share data with researchers across the globe. And that makes them like better use of their data. They can reuse certain data. But it also means that like other rules and classifications come in place. So that means that you need to dynamically give, remove, mask, redact data based on the users, like the researchers' geography, their citizenship, maybe a certain legal entity, if like a company is doing mergers or if they actually split, their like approved purposes, etc., on that data. And that means that if like that data will split up in 2 branches, then maybe only researchers should see only data from one sub-branch and others for the others. So an example that we've seen in real life is where like the US DOJ gave specific data sovereignty regulations. So if there was like US healthcare data, US patients' data, it could only be used by researchers based in the US, unless there were certain like break glass exceptions that were very audited and governed. But that rule came out of the blue. People had to enforce that. Instead of having to go to like your thousands of objects and define all the masking, there's one policy that could be implemented that take this rule, and then Immuta took care of like masking all the data. For the last like example, I'd like to give it back to Sandra to give more details on like how we can do that based on like surf analytics and go into more details.
Sure. So this is another use case, and I would like to talk to you at a time when a customer wanted to scale a self-service data marketplace on Databricks with governance strong enough for a regulated environment. So they needed to move past manual approvals and static roles and force the rules in real time and stay audit ready all the times. Sorry, let me actually. There we go. So you see, I'm used to Teams than Zoom. So what I was saying here, so here the customer wanted to, in a nutshell, adopt Immuta. So what we did was to, we kept Collibra as the single source of governance through and translated its classification and tags into attribute-based policies in Immuta. We also integrated Immuta natively with Databricks, so access is evaluated at query time and changes in Collibra apply immediately. We also designed the marketplace flows that auto-approve low-risk requests and send only real exception to stewards, always with full context. And we redefined the operating model, so steward own policy instead of processing tickets. Okay, to make it more tangible now, a business analyst finds a data set in the data marketplace, requests them, and usually get access in the same day. Sensitive data is masked dynamically, and every query is logged for audit, so the basics of GxP. In short, access time dropped from days to hours, steward effort fell sharply, and governance became enforceable with every decision linked to policy. Francisco.
Thank you very much, Sandro. And to both you, Sandro, and Bart, thank you very much for both of your presentations. Now we're off to Q&A, and we're almost done. But first, let me actually cover what we have for you guys. So, first question, automated access sounds good, but will our QA team and auditors accept it in a GxP environment? And I think, Bart, I can ask you to reply to this one.
Yeah, I think I already tried to cover that in like the use cases examples. And what we see is that like automated access is typically easier to defend than manual access. Like if you have like a long list of like manual approvers, and you need to check them all by one, that's difficult. And in a list, like you probably need to check if people have done a training, if they are like assigned to a certain like privacy like classification, etc. And for every single person, you need to prove it. And then if you want to audit it, you need to prove that like one by one. Instead of checking that, like if you have that automated, a link with an e-learning system where you have that certification, or that link to the trial system where you have that association, you can actually prove that based on like just reviewing those rules. And then like in summary, like instead of having to check like a list of like screenshots and like people having Teams messages say like, yes, I've done my training, please accept my review. If you can just say like, here you have the rules and here's the policies, that makes it a lot easier for the QA team and auditors to check and keep that GxP compliant.
And we've had plenty of those screenshots and requests manually over time.
I bet.
Sandro, maybe one for you now.
Mhm.
We have used roles, so RBAC, for years, and we have thousands of them. How do we move to attribute-based access without putting live trials at risk? So definitely a sensitive topic.
So the question is, they use the old-fashioned way to deal with access control, and how we move to Immuta, basically, for what I understood, without putting live trial at risk. Okay, so I will say start small. The trick is to start small. This is a mantra for data governance. Every time you might heard many times, but that is the key. So one well-defined area at a time. For example, we may start with therapeutic area or a clinical data product. Okay, prove that it works, then expand it. The idea is to do this indeed step by step, domain by domain, and this is actually why we exist. So BI4ALL, that's why is a good idea talking about the maturity assessment. So you identify where to start. If you start in this way with maturity assessment first, you identify where a risk sits, and you can start scaling with more control. So that I would say is the answer.
All right, thank you very much. And maybe there's time for one more question. Bart, maybe to you, how do you manage access to genomics and patient data across countries with GDPR, data sovereignty rules, and US restrictions? Wow, it's there's a lot in here. So a lot of different rules, different laws between the EU and US.
And that's the rules today, right? Like there will be more following, and like I'm sure there will be a new rule or regulation coming soon from one country or the other. And that has two sides of it. Like it's one, like how can we make sure we comply with the rules on the data and that we have those rules applied to the right data sets. At the other end, that's about like as a user, how do we make sure that they are in that right country with the sovereignty, etc. So if you look at the data, like is the right rule applied to the right data? So if you have a platform where policies gets applied to data based on metadata, there's this one place where you can like update the policy, you can update the rule, like a new regulation come in, like new policy, and then Immuta takes care of that rule being applied to all your different data sets. So like that's one side of the equation. But then the other side of the equation, okay, but like if there is data sovereignty rules, for example, can we guarantee that people are in the right country? And that might be information that Immuta is using for the policy. So we have a customer that integrated Immuta with their VPN solution that will check like what's the location of the end user's laptop. And the moment the laptop was seen in one of the embargoed countries, Immuta directly revoked the access because like that's no longer falling on the sovereignty rules. So you're not just checking, hey, where's somebody based on the HR system, but you actually know like, okay, where is this person's laptop to make sure to get that data. And with those rules applied, you can give faster time to data, but still prove it. And that all comes back to like how you define those policies based on rules and regulations. I hope that answered it.
Yes, I think you did very much so. And Sandro, I think you still have control, if I can ask you. Thank you very much. So as a final slide, and if there is one takeaway, I would say that the platform decision is the easy 20%. And with Immuta, you have quite the good decision. The 80% of the challenging part is definitely designing governance, understanding the maturity, and understanding how to promote change in a regulated environment. And I would say that's what we do at BI4ALL, that's what we do well with Immuta and in pharma. For everyone attending, I would like to thank you for joining us today, and also remind you that we will ask for your feedback over email on a very quick form. Thank you very much. Have a nice Monday and a nice week.